My name's Joe Boden. I'm a professor in psychological medicine at the University of Otago, Christchurch, which is the medical campus of the University of Otago here in Christchurch. I'm also the director of the Christchurch Health and Development Study, which I will tell you a little bit more about. But Will's asked me along today to talk about a few things with respect to the referendum on the legalization of cannabis, which we're voting on in October now. It was September, but when they added a month, it was very disappointing because I'm frankly a bit talked out about it. Here we go. So there's just a short history of cannabis legislation in New Zealand. In 1965, the Narcotics Act criminalized the possession and supply of cannabis. And the funny thing about the Narcotics Act in 1965 is there actually wasn't very much cannabis in New Zealand at the time. It really actually only arrived a few years later. And the reason why it was passed is because we were required to do so, being members of the United Nations. And in 1961, the United Nations passed their compact on illicit drugs, and cannabis was made illegal all over the world. So we really didn't have much cannabis in New Zealand before that time, but then it started to arrive in the late 1960s and then into the 1970s. And you got to the point where in the early 1970s, there was on average about 15,000 arrests for cannabis offenses in New Zealand per year. That piece of legislation was altered by the Misuse of Drugs Act in 1975. And a key feature of the Misuse of Drugs Act is that it was the only crime on the books that the police didn't need a warrant to search your house or your car. They were allowed to search either just simply on suspicion that you might have drugs. So every other crime, the police would have to have a warrant to search you, but for drugs, they didn't, which seems a bit wrong. And then nothing happened for a very long time. This piece of legislation remained for a very long time. In 2018, the Misuse of Drugs Medicinal Cannabis Act was passed, which allowed cannabis for medicinal use, and at the time, because there wasn't a structure or framework for it, it was considered a positive, affirmative defense if you had cannabis on your person that you were using it for medicinal purposes. That's now been replaced by a medicinal cannabis framework where people have access to pharmaceutical grade products that are all very expensive. And in August of last year, 2019, there was an amendment to the Misuse of Drugs Act, which essentially caused drug possession to be decriminalized. So if you have a small amount of drugs on you, the police are not supposed to arrest you or prosecute you, but rather are supposed to divert you in some way. And the police are meant to show that any prosecution is in what they call the public interest. And I was curious as to how that was going. It was done last August, but a few weeks ago, the New Zealand Herald reported that the number of arrests and convictions for drug possession hasn't dropped at all. So the police aren't actually doing what they've been told to do. So just a few facts about cannabis in New Zealand. It's the fourth most commonly used psychoactive drug after alcohol, caffeine, and tobacco. In some age groups, it's more popular than tobacco. So for some people, it's the third most popular. In terms of overall consumption, New Zealand is 9th in the world. So we're very, I can't do this without puns, so we're very high up in the rankings. I'm sorry, the subject lends itself to many puns. We're 9th in the world in consumption. Our study, the Christchurch Health and Development Study, which is a group of people born in the 1970s, and the Dunedin Multidisciplinary Health and Development Study, which you'll have heard about, another group of people born in the 1970s. The estimates in each of our studies is that about 80% of each cohort has reported using cannabis at least once. So it's extremely common. the police in 2013 started to use what they call discretion in cannabis arrests. So cannabis arrests dropped from that peak of about 15,000 to about 3,000 a year from 2013. However, of those 3,000-ish per year, over 40% of them are Māori. And in terms of our own study, Māori were, we looked at cannabis arrests and convictions in our cohort, and Māori were about 3 times more likely to be arrested or convicted of a cannabis offense than non-Māori. That's after for statistically controlling for different rates of use in the populations. And our own data as well show that being arrested or convicted of a cannabis offense doesn't actually change your behavior. So of the people who reported an arrest or conviction, and we have official data on this so we could verify that they had, 95% of them carried on using cannabis or increased their use. So for most people, it didn't change their behavior. So the law, the purpose of prohibition as a law is to stop people doing something, and 80% of them had tried it anyway. And having the force of the law applied to you is supposed to correct your behavior or stop you doing it, and that clearly didn't work. And this law is being applied in a racially biased manner. So clearly, prohibition doesn't work. And I borrowed this from Martin Bradbury. I told him I'd credit him. And he says, cannabis prohibition has been one of the most spectacular social policy failures New Zealand has ever embarked upon. Right? We started on it for no good reason. We kept it in place, and it's done nothing really to actually help people. So just a bit about our study. The Christchurch Health and Development Study was comprised of 1,265 individuals born in the middle of 1977. There were infants enrolled by their mothers, and it was 97% of the babies born in Christchurch between the 15th of April and the 15th of August of that year were enrolled in the study. They've been studied since birth, all the way up to age 40. We got, obviously, much of our information in the early days from their parents, primarily their mothers, but then their teachers when they went to school, cohort members when they were 7 years old. We started interviewing them, and partners, friends. We have official record data primarily around health and justice records, but we've collected an estimate of something like 60 million characters of data over the 40 years of these people's lives. And what we try to do with respect to things like substance use is we examine population patterns of substance use and substance use disorder, and we want to investigate possible causal mechanisms that link early life experiences, family functioning, individual characteristics to later behavior, and then the consequences of that into the future. In terms of cannabis, we started asking the cohort members about their cannabis use when they were 13 years old, and we simply said, have you ever tried cannabis? And 5 of them said that they had. By 15, that grew to about 10%, and by 18, that grew all the way to 50%. Right? So that period between 15 and 18 was the big onset period. Now, I just want to quickly go over a few of our major findings in this area. And the CHDS was in the late 90s, and the following decade was at the forefront in some of the psychiatric epidemiological literature around the psychosocial harms associated with cannabis use. So just a few things about that. This just shows you the growth of cannabis use and cannabis dependence. That top line is cannabis use, where we get to about 80%. The second line is regular cannabis use, and that means that you're using at least weekly at some point in your life. And as you can see, while lots of people have tried it, not nearly as many take it up regularly. is it's actually referred to now as cannabis use disorder. About 15% of the cohort have met criteria for that at some point in their lives. It's basically to the extent to which your use of cannabis is causing problems in your life that you recognize. Now, I just want to pick three things that we looked at in terms of psychosocial harms. The first one is a link between cannabis use and poor educational attainment. And as you can see there on the horizontal axis, what we're showing there is rates of completion of different levels of schooling. So secondary was school cert at the time, so you had to have at least one passing grade in a school certificate exam. University enrollment and completing your degree. And what that shows you, with the black bar being the lowest, is that the younger you are when you start using cannabis, the less likely you are to complete educational qualifications. A lot of this has to do with school exclusion, so cannabis is one of the few things that you can actually be automatically excluded from school for. So some of these people would have been excluded. That rolls onto unemployment. So again, on the horizontal axis, we've estimated the amount of times that people had used cannabis between the time when they were 15 and 21 years old. That rightmost bar is people who used at least weekly or more often during that period. And as you can see, their rates of unemployment were considerably higher than people who hadn't used cannabis before they were 21. Again, probably tied to education and the fact that that poor educational outcomes lead to less stable employment. There's a possibility that we have observed in our study a cannabis gateway effect, in that using cannabis, again, more heavily at younger ages leads you to be at greater risk of using other possibly more dangerous illicit drugs. As you could probably see there, that gradient is really steep for when you're younger, between 14 and 15, but it's much less steep when you're in your mid-20s. And of the cohort, about 45% had used illicit drugs other than cannabis by age 25. The third area that we looked at is the possible linkage between use of cannabis and psychotic symptomatology, not when you're high, of course, but rather when you're not. And this is a sort of very old idea, but it is the case that people who were using cannabis more often, that is, regular users, at least weekly users, had higher rates of psychotic symptomatology, so symptoms of paranoia and things like that. However, it's really important to note that the percentage of people who actually report these things is relatively low, and most of the symptoms that were reported are very mild symptoms. In fact, the most common one was, I sometimes have thoughts that other people do not share. Which is listed as a symptom, but and in fact, I had a student look at it this past winter to compare symptom profiles between the people who hadn't used cannabis at all and the ones who had used cannabis quite a lot, and the symptom profile was the same. So even though they reported more symptoms, they weren't reporting more severe symptoms. In fact, the most common symptom for everyone was, I sometimes have thoughts that other people do not share. The heavy cannabis users were not reporting, the sort of hallucinations and delusions or anything like that. We're talking about a substance here that has some harms, and we've contributed to this literature in this. But we're talking about a substance that exists in large quantities in New Zealand, right? So we don't import it; it grows here very easily. So the question is, what do we do about that? The approach that we've taken has criminalized people. It is done so in a discriminatory manner, and it doesn't appear to have stopped people at all. So what's a way of approaching this? Well, a lot of public health people, including myself, were approached by the Ministry of Justice asking us what we thought a good model for regulation would be. And most of us said something like this, that if we're going to change this, then we need to make sure that it's very strictly controlled. That is, what we don't want is an ultra free market situation as we do with alcohol now, which contributes to increasing alcohol-related harm because there's just free-for-all on advertising, nearly a free-for-all on the number of outlets where it's available, and you can buy it just something like 21 out of 24 hours of the day. So the only times that you can are between 4 and 7 a.m., I think. So we don't want that. We don't want it being available to young people, because the harm that we showed you is accruing primarily to people who start at younger ages and are using more heavily at younger ages. So we don't want adolescents using it, and the fact of the matter is, right now, adolescents can get their hands on it very easily. And it certainly seems iniquitous that this business that exists out there is been estimated to be worth about $500 million. And the only tax that anyone involved in the business pays is GST when they buy things. Right? So there's no tax on the industry, on their profits, no tax collected from people who are working in it. So it exists completely outside of that system. It's a bit like people who flip houses who aren't taxed either. That doesn't seem fair. And we suggested that part of this tax, if it were sold, should be used, at least in part, for health funding. And this has actually been put into the bill. But most importantly, any changes in the legal status of cannabis have to be accompanied by evaluation. So we have to see that what we're doing isn't causing more harms or harms that we hadn't envisioned. And we're not always good at evaluating social change and law change, but we need to do that. Now, I don't know if you've looked at the bill. It came out during lockdown, which was really good because I had time to read it. It's 161 pages of legal talk, legal writing. But the little mailer they sent out about 4 or 5 weeks ago is actually a good encapsulation of what's in the bill. So it creates a legal regime whereby cannabis will be sold in retail shops that are not allowed to advertise, that have strict opening hours, that the community is going to be consulted about their location and density and all of these things. And the purchase age is set at 20 years. And in fact, look, I could go on and telling you the details of the bill, but the most important thing to note is that if this passes, and the bill comes to, because it still has to be debated by Parliament, but if it comes into being as similar to what it is, this will be the absolute most strictly regulated product in New Zealand. There's no product that will have more regulations, rules, or attached to it. Now, how would strict legal regulation help the kinds of things that I talked about before? In terms of education, we could reduce school exclusion because it's obviously no longer a prohibited substance, but also those young people who are using it actually are more likely to be able to get help. So we remove stigma around it and also increase opportunities for treatment in terms of the health vote. The Cannabis Gateway, well, one of the things that was observed is that Cannabis Gateway is quite likely a product of prohibition itself. And that is, for example, in the Netherlands, where cannabis has been decriminalized for 46 years, they didn't observe a Cannabis Gateway to other drugs because you don't have to see a drug dealer to get cannabis. And drug dealers frequently have other products to sell. And the Cannabis Gateway could very well be broken by access to legal cannabis. In terms of psychosis, well, the thought is that one of the culprits in the psychosis link is THC, the primary psychoactive ingredient in cannabis. And this could actually be reduced through things like clear product labeling, which is provided for in the bill, especially THC content and limits on content, which will let people know exactly what's in what they're buying and consuming. And of course it'll be pure also, and there won't be anything else added to it, which would hopefully provide a safer experience for users. So the referendum is really just a yes/no question, whether you agree that we should have a legal regime or not. The purpose of it is to shift consumption from this illicit market to a legal market over time, because it does take time and it won't eliminate the black market in a day. But you don't want to grow that market either. Right? The goal is not to grow the market, but to shift it. It will be safer for consumers. It will be safer for society. But the most important thing is, this isn't a referendum on whether you think people should use cannabis, because that is decided in reality. Right? It is here, and there's no amount of police or military or whatever that's going to make it go away, because it's just too big. It can't be eradicated. The only way to take control of it and improve people's health outcomes is to control it, and that is through a legal but highly regulated market. And just want to acknowledge my collaborators, our cohort members who provided us with these data so generously over the years, and our major funders.
Awesome. That's wonderful, Joe. Hey, usually we would save questions for after the assembly, but if we might spend 5 minutes just to sort of do questions now, if that's all right. Does anyone have any?
I've got a question.
Yep.
When, in other places, when they've gone to a legalisation, how's the impact on cannabis use changed?
Well, the important thing to note is the sky has never fallen in anywhere where it's been legalized. There hasn't really been evidence of increases in young people. And in fact, the Centers for Disease Control in the U.S. just a week ago Friday put out some data showing that between 2013 and 2019, cannabis use dropped in the 15 to 18 year age group steadily. And that's even when legalization began in some states in 2014. So it hasn't actually arrested this slide in use in young people. It has gone up in some adult groups. So in Canada, for example, middle-aged men increased their use. But my thought is that these are guys who remembered that they liked it back in the day, had stopped using because it's illegal, and now it's legal again, so they thought they'd go back to it.
I already know how I'm voting, which is yes, but
Me too.
But one bug I have is walking down the street of the smokers and vapors. Am I protected? Like, is smoking, is it restricted to private residents?
It's restricted to private residents and licensed premises where it's for consumption, which I'm not quite sure how.
They can't sell it.
Hmm?
They can't sell it.
They can't. Yeah, they can't actually sell it there.
Right.
So, and the places where it is sold, you can't consume it, and they're not allowed to sell anything else.
Thinking about the pee epidemic, you mentioned that it ceases to be, or lessened as a gateway drug. Do you have any estimate or view on the effect of if the new legislation goes through, that the pee epidemic will be impacted?
Well, it's really hard to say because you've got kind of push-pull forces at work. One is that people won't have to see drug dealers to get cannabis anymore, so they might be less likely to use things like pee and stuff like that. But at the same time, at the moment, the people who are selling these things basically have two earners, and their bigger earner is methamphetamine. They'd sell cannabis also, but if they lose that, they might be, they're kind of stuck in the meth business.
So encouraged to push it harder?
Yeah, quite possibly. I sense this. I normally give talks to groups of elderly people, and who are typically pretty conservative. I sense that this is not a terribly conservative room. But in actual fact, there's no reason why this kind of approach wouldn't necessarily work for other drugs either. But you have to start somewhere. And in fact, it's worth noting that at the moment in the UK, they've rolled out a trial, or they've continued a trial of providing heroin to heroin addicts as maintenance rather than to keep them kind of living normal lives rather than the hard life of being an opioid addict.
The business too, just to reduce the business opportunity.
Yeah.
And also stops crime relating to heroin as well. So for example, if you're an addict and you don't have any money to buy heroin, you're likely to try and acquire that money. So supplying it in the amount of dose needed to sate that addiction and not, go further and not go less than that, actually keeps those people engaged with the public healthcare system, and it also means that they're not going to be tempted to turn to desperate means to acquire that drug.
And it's been trialled a couple of times in the UK. It's been trialled in Switzerland, and everywhere it's been trialled, it's worked. I think there is some serious scientific and actual. I don't mean moral, but I do in a way, issues in this that are fairly obvious, that this is an inequitous system that we need to do something about. But there's an awful lot of people who seem quite happy to continue sort of casually criminalizing people for something that is probably not hurting them.
All right, I think we'll end there. Thank you very much, Joe. Next, Karen. Yep. All right, thank you very much, Joe.
Normally we have a change of topic, but I think we'll build on that excellent talk. Thank you. This is from a book about cannabis, medical cannabis, but and it's Dr. Susie Wiles who's written this forward to the book. Did you know that reindeer will go to great lengths to get hold of hallucinogenic magic mushrooms? Apparently it makes them drunk. If that's the right word to describe the state of reindeer that's running around aimlessly twitching its head and making strange noises. Of course, it's not just reindeer that like the iconic red and white mushrooms. They've been used by humans throughout history to put people into a trance. Obviously, hallucinogenic mushrooms are not the only drugs we humans have experimented with and will continue to experiment with. Some people are happy with a strong coffee, while others need a large glass of wine or two at the end of the difficult day. But there will always be those who opt for other drugs, and the evidence is really clear. If people are unable to get hold of what they need through legal means, then they will find another way. One that puts massive amounts of money into the pockets of organised crime and can result in people taking drugs of unknown strength and potentially laced with dangerous chemicals such as rat poison. In 2018, the Global Commission on Drug Policy reported that the international war on drugs has been a complete failure. All around the world, hardline drug policies are not reducing either the demand or the supply of illegal drugs. The Commission was clear in its message: rather than continuing with this failed war, we need to move away from prohibition and punishment and instead regulate criminal drug markets out of existence. In other words, we should be legalising the supply of drugs and treating drug addictions as a medical and not a criminal issue. Before you think that this was the conclusion of a bunch of hippies, the Commission includes former heads of state of 12 countries, from Brazil and Colombia to Malawi, Nigeria and Switzerland, as well as our own former Prime Minister Helen Clark. This year, the Commission released a report on the international drug classification system, which they conclude is influenced by ideology, prejudice and the discrimination of marginalised people and the financial interests of the pharmaceutical industry. In other words, your perfectly legal drugs of choice could have been classified another way. The Commission is calling for psychoactive substances to be classified based on the scientific evidence of the drug's potential harms for the people who use them and society as a whole, as well as the possible benefits for those who use the drug in a reasonable way. The government of Aotearoa, New Zealand, recently announced that we'll get the chance to vote on whether to legalise cannabis at the 2020 election. Unsurprisingly, misinformation has already started to spread, and a recent poll suggested public support for legalisation might begin to decline. She was obviously listening to Radio New Zealand this morning. This excellent book is your perfect antidote to the misinformation. Soon you'll know the difference between cannabis and hemp, THC and CBD, and you'll also understand a little more the many reasons people might choose to use cannabis. Ultimately, though, come voting day, you should be asking yourself just one question. Should our laws around cannabis really be supporting organised crime and placing users in harm's way?
Thank you for that, Cam. what was the name of that book?
Medical cannabis.
Great. All right. So I thought I would just say a couple of things as we wrap up. We've got one last song for you, and then we do a thing here called a minute of reflection, in which we just have a minute of silence to sort of contemplate, anything you need to contemplate, really. It's kind of up to you. I sometimes think about, the people that are important to me, or the pets that are important to me that have passed in my life. But however you want to spend that time is up to you. I think that it's quite, great for someone that doesn't practice meditation to sort of just take some time out of my life to think about, just have a moment of silence. But before we get to that, I thought I'd just say that I'm aware of the contrast with a church organisation, for example, that says, this particular issue is bad and you should be against it, and this particular issue is good and you should be for it. And we don't want to do that here. I've made comments that sort of make it clear how I'm voting, and so has Cam, who's also on the committee. We've invited Joe here, not specifically for his position, but mainly because of his expertise. And I'm sure that his position he has arrived at that position as a result of that expertise. I think it is really important to try and look at the evidence that you can, but at the same time, it is going to be down to people's decisions. But yeah, I thought I'd just say that because I think you sort of get lost a bit sometimes in sort of saying, oh, this is the position of us, and everyone who's against that is wrong. So I thought I'd just say that.